I was born and brought up in South Africa, and I think my first experiences with like shifts in consciousness was with the black people. On the farm next door, I used to go down and sit at the feet of the old man, and I was aware of a experience of peace inside. And when you go home, you don't feel quite the same frequency. And then when I was at university, out of the blue, I said I wanted to study consciousness. And at that stage, it included drugs, dreams, death, and meditation. And one of the work I did was actually on drugs. And then when I started my master's, I thought, how could I ask anybody else about consciousness if I'd never experienced anything inside myself? So I left university and I began a search, but also incorporated in my own life and development. And I left South Africa more for political reasons, went to Spain. I came back from Spain when Mandela was let loose, and I went back to Spain and I married my present husband. And I tried to have children, and I had multiple miscarriages. And they gave me a lot of medication. And I certainly had experiences with consciousness, not of the most pleasant nature. And I could either sweep it under the carpet, like everybody was advising me to do, or I could take it that something really, I had these experiences, you know, I wasn't going to deny them. And I also realized then I really had to find out for myself. So what was sort of like an interest beforehand became a passion. And a few days later, the book of Sergo Rinpoche, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, arrived in my hands. And I thought, oh, this person knows something about some of the states I'd been experiencing, the Bardo states. So I went off to England, and I was staying in the shrine room. People who came from outside could. I really went to England to do a course with him on death and dying. But I also went into their meditation group. But I began having experiences again. And people in the Buddhist environment kept saying, oh, this is just movements of your mind. And by then, I'd been through so much, I realized I couldn't just write it off to my mind. I felt that I was receiving information, and I certainly was seeing somebody in my meditations. And to cut a long story short, through the person, after the first course, they wouldn't let us stay there. I went to stay with somebody who said they'd recognized me from a previous life. And I described this person who was coming to me in my meditations. And she said, oh, I know him. So I thought, hey, this is kind of peculiar. Another friend of mine had come and seen me, who'd helped me tremendously when I'd had these miscarriages. And she said, by the description of the person, it was Muktananda, because she was in the Gurumai line. And now this other friend of mine says they know the person. The one says it's Muktananda. And she said, we'll phone him up. So we phone this person up, and I get on the phone and I explain that when I'm meditating, I see this face, and one says it's Muktananda, and the other says it's you. So he said, what your friend doesn't know, I lived with Muktananda. You have to come to my house straight away. So after my experiences, after my miscarriages, you know, I was really open to anything, because nothing could have been more frightening than the drugs they'd given me. And I went, And he saw me and he said, "You're coming to meet somebody who is coming to my flat tonight." And I said, "No, I'm going to a course." And he said, "No, you've come to England to meet this person who's coming to my flat tonight." And he took me into his shrine room and he put in a video, and I looked at it and I said, "You're quite right."
He put a video
of a certain person, yes.
Okay. Of Muktananda?
No, this was then another person. The two, Muktananda and this Swami, looked exactly the same. But it was to meet a third person. And when I met him, I had the most incredible experience I've ever had in my life. And it was like somebody had, after all that wanting to experience consciousness, somebody gave me a tremendous gift. And I was told then to find my own way back there by myself. So I worked with the yogi Srinivas Arka for over 20 years, using his method of meditation. And that brought me so far. And then one day I said to him, "And now, where do I go?" And he said, "Back to university." I wasn't planning, but
wow.
I went back to university and I got my master's and my doctorate recently. So if I can do it, anybody else can do it. And by then I really was looking to my intuition. So when it said you have to put, you look at embryology as well, I just did it.
So I'm so fascinated from what you delivered in the main room in terms of your research and your work on the scientific part of understanding who we are. So what can we know, what can we understand about who we are, about the self, about the soul, by looking at the moment of conception? What is there for us? What is the teaching? What is being revealed in this sacred act of creation?
Well, I think we've all been under a misconception about what happens during conception, because most of us have been told that it's the fastest and the strongest sperm that wins a race. And it's, as you saw in the film, which is the work of Jaap van der Waal, it's nothing like that. And when you see this beautiful dance of multiple sperms, tens of hundreds of sperms, and her who move and they start a dance.
So the egg stays still.
No, the egg stays, but they're vibrating with their tails, which are very moving, and they move the whole thing.
And they move together.
Yeah. So they put their head end into her crown, and this creates a movement. Yeah. So I just, in some of the conferences, I show this, because I think if people could see the beauty of life, we can talk, and I did this morning, with some of the things that are that are touching ethical boundaries, but I also like to work through the positive. And if we can see the beauty of what's happening, and that's not only the beauty of what's happening in the embryo, it's the beauty of what happened in us. We can't divorce the embryo from us. We did go through those stages. It's personal, it's not just scientific. With the stages that Jaap van der Waal talks about, that we first the mineral stage, and then we put down roots like a plant. And then there's the animal phase where the heart starts moving down and goes through from a worm to fish, reptile, birds,
this is
and
all
mammals.
that is happening in the embryo. These
It's
are the
all
stages
happening,
you're
yes.
describing. So the egg and the sperm, they dance
They
and
dance.
vibrate together.
Right.
And then what happens?
Then she lets one in. And from then on, what van der Waal calls the mineral stage takes place. So instead of multiplying cells, we get cleavage, we get inside. I always, when I think of minerals, I sort of think of like a geode formed by an amethyst, you know how crystals are facing inwards, and there's this very special water in the center of a geode. And this divides first 2, 4, 8, and then the center cells begin to die off, and they form around the outside until they form what will become the germinal disc. Now, where Jaap van der Wal is different to other embryologists, he considers this part of the embryo. Many embryologists feel only the germinal disc is part of the embryo. So for him, both the ectoderm and the endoderm are the embryo. This has a huge impact on how we conceive the embryo, because if we conceive that right from conception it's a living being, a living human being, what we do with those cells, our metaphysics will decide what is ethical behavior and what is not. So most people don't think of their metaphysics, but it's very, very important. So either we've just got a heap of cells there that we can do what we like with, or we've got a living being that's coming into form. And how we treat that living being will be totally different depending on how we conceive it.
And at what stage the heart is developed?
Yes. In the second phase, when it's in the plant phase, and these capillaries that go down into the mother's womb, blood forms there, and then it's sent through capillaries to the top end of the germinal disc, and then it flows down through their veins and goes back for new nutrients, oxygen, etc. But on day 17, there's the first pulsations, and that is the heart primordium. So all we have is a tube that's now pulsating at the top of the germinal disc. And if we were a plant, of course we'd grow upwards. There wouldn't be a heart, but we would grow up towards the light. But in the embryo, it curves inwards, and it actually forms three-dimensional space now by going inwards, because what's essentially a flat organism now becomes three-dimensional, and there's the mesoderm layer that's formed with this as the heart primordium begins to fold in a certain way. And there I join it with the work of Dr. Tarrant Wasp, another scientist who I feel should have received much more acknowledgement for his work. He literally unraveled the heart, and by pressing on these lines in the heart, he goes round and round, and eventually he lands up with a muscular band with the tubes where the arteries and the artery and the main vein will go into. And that muscular band is folded as it moves down. It folds into a double helix. I feel that his work has not been fully recognized by science, because if we've got a muscle and we haven't got an object with 4 chambers, how we're going to treat that muscle will be also very different. Because if there's tension in a muscle, you know, we're going to be closing those chambers more, and if it's too relaxed, it could go to the other extreme. So am I going to just treat it with pills and maybe operations, or am I going to work with it as a muscle which can release tensions? And maybe, like in quantum physics, maybe there is an entanglement with the genes also in our body. So whatever happens to the heart is also affecting the shape of our genes, let's put it that way. Yeah.
So at what stage the brain begins to be developed? Way later, correct?
Okay, well, before conception, and this is where I join the other work of another tremendously great scientist. He worked in Yale University in 1933, Burr, and he took, first of all, salamander eggs then he worked on frogs, and then he worked on chicks. But he felt that the material layer was not the first layer. So he developed an instrument, a voltmeter, and he was able to show that the highest positive potential was near the equator of an egg, and the negative potential was on the circumference of an egg. But after conception, he found that the head was where the positive pole is, and the tail is where the negative pole is. And seeing that that line, that energetic line, maybe we can, if we were talking in previous ages, we'd say spiritual line, because I think when we talk about these non-physical electrical lines, they have a parallel to the word spirituality. Not all, but the type of way of looking at reality can be seen using modern terms, but it can also be seen using previous terms. And seeing that that line, that potential is there even before conception, to me it's showing that there is an indicator in space which will line us up. No architect has ever built a building and taken a pile of bricks and waved a magic wand and a house appears. First of all it's a thought, and then they'll put coordinates. And I feel that nature also works, but through electrical lines, to help position the person or position.
So you're saying the design is already there in the electrical lines?
Well, certainly the head-tail. Certainly the head-tail. I think there's multiple. I think when I say head-tail, that's just one of the coordinates we know. But science can only go as far as their instruments. So unless somebody develops new instruments to test whether there's more lines that guide this, we don't know whether there's more lines that guide this. We know that genes have a role in this, but not in the coordination in space. Mm-hmm. So I don't see why we don't have a model with multiple possibilities that add to the morphology of the organism.
So what I'm hearing, help me understand, you're saying that this process of creation is happening in a larger field that has already intelligence. It has encoded the intelligence of
Yes. And when I listen to some scientists talk of consciousness, they're talking of consciousness of something. I think maybe from the work of Herschel, who talks of the qualia, they've got this idea. But if you go into phenomenology from the Eastern perspective, you're actually looking at the nature of consciousness itself. So it's not what consciousness is conscious of, it's can I experience the different levels of consciousness. So when I work and teach this meditation method, which is from the mind to the heart, I'm following a method made by Srinivas Arka, but he's also got a theory of consciousness. So you move from thinking mind consciousness to feeling heart-mind consciousness. It's all part of mind as well, but it's different levels. So we first of all have got to go below the subconscious layer, because normally we're not used to getting information consciously from the field of the heart-mind consciousness. So then he goes to the emotional heart consciousness, so mind consciousness and pure consciousness. But for my PhD, I tested I wanted to find out more about the third level, because I think we can all get to the third level, because I think that's part of our consciousness as children.
And what's the third level? Guide me through the levels.
Okay, so you've got thinking mind consciousness.
And that's you call?
That's what we normally train people to develop.
Yes.
It's more information about the world, and we're also using our senses about the world.
Yes.
And many of us have forgotten our childhood when we operated in a different level of consciousness. And I do say to my pupils, when you were a child, Christmas never came. It was slow. Time was slow. You know, we lived in another reality of consciousness. So to know more about the third level, I made a scale. This is subliminal mind, because we've got to go into the subliminal layers, yes, which are layers which are normally below our conscious level. Yes. So now we go into the feeling heart-mind consciousness, and I asked some of my pupils to describe the quality of the consciousness. We're going into, when we go into levels of consciousness, we're talking about the quality of consciousness, not what consciousness is conscious of, but the quality. So I think most of us will know what thinking mind consciousness is, a very busy idea of thoughts coming and going all the time, with hardly any peace from thoughts. But once we get into the heart mind consciousness, then the questions that I had in my scale were more about, I feel more connected, I feel more centered, I feel more silence, I feel more peace. And they had to rate these, before they learned the method of meditation and then afterwards. And yes, there was a big difference. I mean, I've known that from teaching meditation for many years, but this was a way of showing that we could actually test levels of consciousness. What I love about Arka's theory, it's testable. So we can do a scale, or we could even measure, but from the outside in. And I also had open questions. And then as the people go deeper, we could do scales, or we could do even change in using the PIP camera of how the aura changes around the person. So it is a testable theory of consciousness, which I don't think there are many of those around. But it has to be done by a scientist and somebody who has explored their own consciousness, so they can direct the questions or the statements of what the quality of that consciousness is. Because most scientists live in their thinking mind consciousness, and they do not realize there are other levels. So until we experience other levels, we say,
So our research, scientific research, is limited to seeing the world through that one limited lens.
Through that one line.
Yeah.
And then mainly, and I've just written a paper on this that's been published, consciousness from the outside in and the inside out. And most theories are in science are all from the outside in, because whether we're taking from electrode information or mapping the brain, or whether we're taking Freud, Jung, or that, they were making theories about the consciousness of another person. So I call that the outside in. Whether they're good or bad, and that's not what I'm trying to judge them, but it's not from my own explorations and being able to identify there are different levels. Now, Arka will say there's 6 main levels, but the experiences within those levels are, of course, unique. Yeah. It's not that we're all the same, but the levels we go through, if we follow a heart-based method, because meditation can also be above the mind, so above the thinking mind. Yeah. But if we go below, these are the levels that we go through. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, how the study of embryology and the beginning of life helped you see your own journey going through. How do you see, let's say, the miscarriages you had? How did your studies inform that experience, and what would you say to other human beings, other mothers that have gone through that journey?
We can go about bringing a new being down to earth in different ways. I think what's now become assisted fertilization, intravenous. We're going to a radical extreme. We don't trying to prepare the body to have a baby. We can either try and work with someone to maybe change their habits, change their thinking patterns, so they can prepare their own body to receive a baby. Most of us are very stressed and our energy is here, but to have a baby you need your energy here. You know, otherwise there's no conception, and certainly to keep it. So I'd had tuberculosis as a child and been given multiple drugs for 7 years, and nobody ever said, you know, you have to clean out your system completely. So my whole process was also about really cleaning myself up, both on a physical level, emotional level, and same as trying to find harmony in a process that had taken place, and understanding, because I couldn't just sweep it under the carpet. I had to find, maybe people weren't saying what was happening, and I found energetic lines in my body, you know, and there was no one I could talk about this to, and I had to start working this out for myself, because I decided I wasn't crazy. These had occurred, and I needed to understand what had happened. So for me it was quite natural to also look at what happens in embryology. And from my first, after learning to meditate in the method I teach, I became a craniosacral therapist. And again, I'm working on the edge of science, because they don't fully recognize the movements of the craniosacral fluid in the body. But when you work on that level through your hands, you pick up a lot of information. And some you don't know how to fit together. So we welcome people like Jaap van der Waal with his stories of the embryo, because it makes sense to us with the work we're doing. Same as Peter Levine was first accepted by craniosacral therapists much more than he was by mainstream psychology.
And yet today he is the leader.
Yeah.
We went to the mainstream psychotherapy conference, and he was the icon, he was the hero for everyone after 30 years.
After 30 years.
Finally recognized.
Finally. So, you know, a lot of the body-based therapists, we were working with these people many years ago, but mainstream wasn't. So, as I said, the work of Jaap van der Waal, I think, is tremendous. And the beauty of seeing that really we've gone through all these kingdoms ourselves, and we had to die to each kingdom to do the next days of our journey. In the first 48 days, we've lived like a mineral which really, as he says, follows the laws of mechanics and physics. But then we had to die to that phase to become a plant. And the plant is about stretching out and expanding. So it's not the same consciousness, the same being, but not the same quality of consciousness in the mineral to the plant. And then, of course, when we go through the animal phases, or the heart does, you know, I don't want people to take this totally literally. You know, now we have an inside and an outside, because now the heart's going down inside. So the development is from a new center inwards, but at the same time it forms an outwards. So again, we're thrown into another whole level of consciousness, mode of consciousness. And to survive, we've got to, because we had to die to the plant stage to go through this stage. And our consciousness has to change our mode of consciousness,
vibration of consciousness as well,
has to change. Yeah. So, as Rumi says in his poem, why fear death? I've died from mineral to become a plant. I've died from vegetativeness to become an animal. So we've already died several times in our life. And also when we're born, we have to die to the placenta. And that was also, according to Van der Waal, not all embryologists, that was part of us. So to separate from a part of us, we had to die to that part. And then the outside universe became another new relationship to the outside. Mm.
So today in contemporary life, women live with so much stress, and young women try to have first careers, find themselves, and later on in life they decide to become mothers, which results in relying on technology to actually conceive. What do you see in this process as we are moving more and more in that direction, really, that life?
I think this is a question we all have to ask ourselves. So I don't want to be emphatic in my answer, but I do feel that we need to think very carefully what we're doing. New technologies are being experimented on us. Science does not, well, it's not so much science because as it goes into technology, it goes into private enterprise. And these are not researched thoroughly until they're done. And then if we say they're harmful, we have to prove they're harmful. I personally feel that many of the technologies, they should be proved safe before they're tried on human beings. So we've got now, I believe, 8 million babies born through fertilization in vitro. There are 2 methods. There's one where the ovules put together with multiple sperm, and it's allowed to dance like I described earlier, and she will select. But sperm injection is that her crown is taken off, his tail is taken off, and it's decided which is the most appropriate, and it's injected into her. There's a degree of violence in this. I'm sorry. If you hear the things on the internet, it sounds so perfect, but you actually see her, what was round, she goes in, and when I first saw it, I just grabbed my uterus. And what we forget is anything we do to that little embryo will eventually show up in genes, because genes are our history. So that we think we can do anything to an embryo, or even in the conception, there's action, reaction. We don't know what the reaction is yet. So for mothers who want to have babies, I think we have to remember we haven't got a right to children. It's a grace. So this applies to mothers and fathers. There are also many children in the world who want parents already born. And this is not about going into a supermarket and choosing, I want it with blue eyes or this or the other. And some of these practices are highly dangerous. The person both who gives the ovules, if it's not the mother itself, is injected with chemicals, and some of them have lost their lives. Because they don't only want one ovule to be produced, they want many so they can collect it at the same time. And I wasn't too familiar on the research on babies that have been born from assisted fertilization, But I believe there's much more research coming up. I believe somebody called Jennifer Lull has done a lot of research. So I can't personally direct you there, but she's a person who's also a nurse who's very concerned about how we're going. And if you're going to choose this method, inform yourself well. Don't just see the pretty picture, see the picture behind. And then each one of us has to live our own lives.
And it's amazing because again, that comes, that desire, oh, now I want a baby. I want to order and have a baby, comes from that culture of separation again. It's like, oh, I want my baby.
Yes.
But what is the effect on the rest of the...
Well, these days, is it even my baby? If I'm going to implant an ovule of somebody else in my body, I'm not actually preserving my heritage, if that's what's so important to the person. So what's the difference of getting a baby that hasn't got parents? If we're not even having our own children, I don't understand the biological urge in terms of that I'm using somebody else's and yet it's not mine. And what's the difference from this lovely little baby that's just been born and maybe hasn't got parents? Yeah.
And that's the beauty, that's where your meditation, you know, that the spiritual work comes in place, is that we actually inquire first. Why? Like, who wants the baby? Or what wants the baby? Does life wants to come? And that's,
I think that really the society has become disconnected from its soul. Jung wrote about this in 1933, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And if we can connect to our deeper self, we get guidance in life. You know, most of us, I think, are like ships floating around on the sea. And if science says, do this, we follow blindly. This week it's olive oil, next week it's margarine. But, you know, most of scientific experiments are short-term. We do not do long-term experiments. So I think our whole way of living, we've become disconnected to our own inner guiding voice, and we ignore it. We prefer that we say, oh, scientists are so clever, you know, they know best. And we're giving away our power. So in the meditation I teach, it's to actually waken up your intuition again and to connect again and believe in how you're being guided. And until we can get there, we can't really make a conscious decision on how we want to live.
So what do you see is possible for science if more scientists are trained and exposed to this kind of intuition of the heart? What is possible for science and humanity?
I think fantastic. I call it the mystical scientist. You know, so when we join the spirituality and the mysticism with the scientist, and then we can work with being guided. So we're not just creating an atom bomb because we want to see whether it works. You know, it's not just about creating a new toy, or, I mean, I know that's terribly serious, but we're not just imagining what we can do. When we can actually contact the deeper self, we can get guidance. And I don't want to go back to an age living without my washing machine, for instance. You know, it's very handy. I'm not saying no to technology, but I'm saying technology from a deeper place. Be guided, bring things, and always work in the framework of what's in our highest good and the highest good of all. Because we must set our intention, you know, and the intention has to be pure. Once we mix in the commercial world and it's only for money, we're just not working from the highest intention. So within an intention that is pure, we can get guidance, and we know what comes up will be in the best interest of all.
It would be lovely to hear your vision on the intelligence of Gaia, that is a living being. You spoke about the intelligence in the genes that especially creates the embryo. It was beautiful to hear.
Yeah.
But if we enlarge the picture and we see the planet as a living being and us as a
matrix of life.
children,
Yeah.
it would be lovely to hear your vision on what this planet is facing in this crisis and which resources maybe we can access to break through this present nowadays crisis.
Can I go back to a question you asked? You asked me about the development of the nervous system and the brain. And when the heart is moving down, so the backbone is also developing, and we go from the primal streak to the notochord, and eventually this closes round and in the spinal cord, and we've got the central nervous system, which eventually develops into the brain. And I did a side-by-side study of the development of the heart and this, and of course the same process, which has taken millions of years, thousands of years, is occurring at the same time. And I think we make a mistake thinking of our body as not being a whole. So people like to look at causes, but really when you see it side by side, you see that as one develops, the other is totally in synchronicity with it. Which brings us to the idea, why look for the brain as a seat of consciousness? Because every part is reflecting that development. So if I look at the universe, it's a mystery, and our body is the same mystery, but maybe I can touch the mystery easier in my body, and I can see it as a whole, and I can get an inkling of how it works. An inkling. And I realize it's just one whole. So if I change my diet, it's going to affect everything. If I change the way I speak, the way I think, it's going to change everything, because it's one. There is absolutely no duality in this form that's in process that I'm interacting with. And this is the same with the earth. Of course, it's the same with the whole cosmos, but we're taking some bodies, like I'm taking the human body. We can take Gaia as a body. And she, of course, is conscious. And her expression of consciousness, her feeling of consciousness is very different to maybe my consciousness. But she's still highly aware. She doesn't fly off one day into a different part of space. She's highly aware by forces of other astral bodies, and she's reacting to them. So as these forces are acting on her, she's reacting. That is consciousness to me. So also the sun doesn't say, I'll get up one day in the east and, oh, today I feel like getting up in the west. No, there are forces that are keeping all this in a balanced way, and all the forces are working on everything. You know, that's why it said it's so difficult to get into the whole without being reductionist. So whatever lens we put on is only a lens. But she, of course, is reacting to this. And I think she's also, well, I see us, we're living in a spacesuit, and we're living on a spaceship, and we're hurtling through space. Yeah. Tremendous. You know, it's that we don't really, are not aware of this. And whatever we do also affects her. Some way science still doesn't recognize the power of our thoughts. But they are a quantum of energy, and they affect our bodies. And can imagine the quantity of thoughts in the environment from all these people on planet Earth, and how that must also affect her. So I feel if we could also tidy ourselves up and maybe get to more of the state of stillness, it would help Mother Earth also get there. And when there's a movement in one part of the planet, I feel there's a repercussion throughout the planet. You know, people look at it as an earthquake or a volcano going off, and they don't see it as all interrelated when other things occur on planet Earth. We don't know how this occurs. But if I change my eating patterns, I affect everything. So if something happens to her, it's got to, you don't have, I'm a whole and she's not a whole. I mean, you know, and the whole cosmos is not a whole. It's all a whole. You know, I mean, that's why the tremendous wonder in trying to at least have a little taste of the mystery of what we're apart. Yeah. So.
And just one last thing, it's so sad in a way that we are living in time that we are mostly focused in our minds, in our brains, and the way science is approaching spirituality is by measuring brain activity while the monks are meditating. And what we are learning is that it's not actually the brain that responds, it's the heart that responds first to meditation, to anything.
Right.
So we are really looking we're studying
in the
place. After effect
yes.
of what really the first center that recognizes and interacts with consciousness is the heart.
Yeah. Because we're living in an electric magnetic field, and electric magnetism is not the only field. So I don't equate all spirituality with only the electric magnetic field. I think there are many fields. But this field is changing all the time, and I think it is through that field and the changes that we have sense impressions. So when we talk about the feeling heart, we're actually getting information from changes in the field. So when we deliver the information, it's through intuition, and then we put words. But if I'm connected to my child and she's sick, then it's actually through the feeling field that we're getting the information.
That's way more direct.
So that's why, at least with my teacher, he talks about women, or especially mothers, being more connected to the heart consciousness. Of course, we all have the possibility to develop this. It's not only for women, but men have traditionally developed more of the mind thinking consciousness. Luckily, there's still women who are still resonating with their heart consciousness, but many women are, you know, you get no prize from being in the heart consciousness. There's no financial reward. We give all the rewards just for being in the thinking mind consciousness. So many women have left the space. I left the space. You know, I had to recover it again. So, and I had to learn to trust it again, and I had to learn to trust this tremendous life force, whether we call it Shakti or whatever, working through us, and let her do the movements, and not me from my mind try and fix something, which takes a lot of time and a lot of trust until we start doing it, and then she responds again. You know, there's an interaction between us. And there's also an interaction with the planet. So she also feels when there's general concern about her, and she interacts with us and also gives us more information. And I feel, getting back to technology, if we tap in there, we can tap into intelligence that we can develop technologies, but we're going to develop technologies that are for all our benefit, not just for financial benefit.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much.
Thank you.